Be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come. That your carriage and life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in every one, whereby in them ye may be a blessing, and make the witness of God in them to bless you.
In this podcast, we are continuing to read from The Eye of Faith, A History of Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative by William P. Tabor, Jr. We will finish reading Chapter 7, A Wider Quakerism, 1917 to 1929. And as we continue reading, James Henderson, a plain 60-year-old minister with sparkling, kindly eyes and a deep, resonant voice, had not been idle since his visit to President Wilson in 1916. He had carried out a concern to visit and speak at about 20 Ohio college campuses. Now he had gone through the usual steps of testing out the new concern. He had held opportunities with families and friends, laid the concern before monthly and quarterly meetings of both men and women, and finally had obtained the unity and hence the necessary endorsements of his liberating minute of the yearly meeting of ministry and elders. James agreed that one well might wonder, as did one visiting friend, why he was called rather than someone else more qualified. James knew no foreign languages. His only qualification was his command of the inward guide and a unity, powerful enough to be felt from his meeting. Following the ancient custom, a committee was appointed, wrote James, not only to see that I was suitably provided with company, but that I would be provided in other ways for the journey. As usual, there were friends from the East at yearly meeting, and one of those knew both French and German. After that last moving session of yearly meeting, described by Ruth Baldiston above, James came upon Alfred Lowry in the meeting house yard and said, "Alfred, canst thou help me out?" Alfred confessed that he had been under much exercise about it, and had concluded that if James asked his help, he would take it as an evidence that it was a right move. So he now agreed to accompany the older man. Thus, furnished with an interpreter companion, funds, the all-important inward qualifications, and the unity of the church, Barnesville farmer and surveyor James Henderson left home February 25, 1920, on a 6-month journey which took him into 8 countries. James and Alfred stopped in England long enough for a visit and several meetings with conservative friends at Fritchley. Although Alfred had acquaintances among friends in London, James made no effort to make contact with the London Yearly Meeting or its Meeting for Sufferings. The two proceeded to Germany via Amsterdam as the unstable conditions in Germany permitted. At this time, many American and British friends were in Germany to supervise the feeding of German children and to administer other forms of relief, so James was able to attend or arrange a number of meetings for worship as he and Alfred traveled among the impoverished and discouraged land. With the help of interpreters, he often spoke, and he was in many homes for visits and opportunities. The two men met with many groups, varying in size from 2 or 3 to 300 people interested in learning more about Quakers. Step by step, James felt his way in the foreign land. For example, he wrote in his journal, "One morning, waking early, probably at 3 or 4 o'clock, there was a sweet covering spread over my mind as I was dwelling somewhat on our future movement, and an impression arose to suggest meeting with guests and others of that household at a suitable time. They traveled through Austria and Yugoslavia to Romania, where James had felt drawn with a concern for these people. There was no corps of AFSC workers, and Alfred, who knew only French and German, hardly knew what to do next, trusting James to follow the drawings of my mind as to our movements in these parts. As James wrote in his journal, James felt led to the local religious leaders, and with the help of a local girl who could speak French, they gradually made contact with the Orthodox clergy, Episcopal priests, and Protestant pastors. Perhaps James Henderson's greatest service in that part of Europe was at a conference of Protestant pastors in Bulgaria, to which he was invited to speak. When the meeting began, he first took a seat in the front row, declining to go up to the speaker's platform. Next, he knelt in prayer without an interpreter. Then he, soon after, felt to go on the platform where my interpreter, who was the pastor we first met, was seated. My whole being was filled with love for the people, and I felt I must tell them so. And they went on as matters arose. My interpreter seemed to be in the spirit of the concern, for I had never spoken so easily and freely to an interpreter before, almost like I was speaking directly to the people, and they were largely receiving it, the divine presence being over us. And afterwards, many came forward to speak and shake hands and express feelingly their appreciation, accepting it as a message from God. Later, he was told, "If you do nothing more than having this meeting with us, it would be worth all the sacrifice you have gone to since leaving America." He did have more conversations at their request, and he made a point of explaining the Quaker attitude towards war, as he always did on such occasions. By the end of July, James and Alfred were back in Vienna, and Alfred left, according to previous plans, for the London All Friends World Conference on July 31st. James was now on his own in Germany, continuing to visit and speak with the help of other friends until he left Hamburg for America on August 21st, reaching Barnesville on September 5th, 1920, a few days before yearly meeting time. Yearly meeting of 1920 was supposed and with a wide world view, and conscientious objectors had returned. On Saturday evening of the yearly meeting, it was the young Albert Livezoy, back from Camp Sherman and the American Friends Service Committee work in France, who called the Alumni Association meeting to order. The following Monday evening, Gilbert Thomas opened the Education Association meeting, which, after quickly disposing of its usual business, heard reports of the Service Committee activities in the local meetings, as well as reports from 3 of the young men returning from Reconstruction work in Europe, James Steer, Albert Livezoy, and Willard Blackburn. On Wednesday evening, it was James Henderson's turn to tell at a meeting of the Aid Association about his travel and ministry through England, Holland, Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Officially, there was no mention of the historic All Friends Conference, which had met in London that summer, and apparently without any official delegate from Ohio yearly meeting. However, Olney's teacher Ruth Balderston, whose family was connected with conservative meetings at Colera, Maryland, had been able to go as a delegate to both All Friends Conference and the Young Friends Conference, which followed. And she wrote for the Only Current a full account of the thrill of world citizenship as you saw a tar-band head beyond the post, saw a Japanese student approaching, or as you noticed an honest black face near you. The next yearly meeting, 1921, took the unusual but not surprising step of reading aloud an epistle from a non-conservative yearly meeting, the first annual meeting of Friends in Germany, and appointed a committee to answer it. In 1922, the German epistle was again read, along with an epistle from Philadelphia and the London General Epistle, and they were all also answered. However, because of the concern of a few of its members, the yearly meeting would soon return to official non-communication with any group not in the circle of conservative yearly meetings. By the 1920s, Fritchley General Meeting in England was included in the conservative circle. Though throughout the 1920s, concerns for peace, international awareness, and fellowship with other Quaker groups were able to find expression through the evening meetings at yearly meeting, the pages of Only Current, the Halfway Picnic, and sometimes the Wilbur Union. Nearly every hour during this decade, the Only Current reported one of the many Only graduates or former teachers abroad as AFSC workers, missionaries, teachers, or delegates to Quaker gatherings or other international events. The people who stayed at home welcomed many AFSC speakers, friends from abroad, and non-Quaker peace workers to a variety of unofficial occasions, including special collections, that's meetings, at the boarding school, whenever such people were traveling that way. During most of the 1920s, the Meetings for Sufferings continued its concern for peace through a legislative committee, sometimes called the Peace Committee, appointed in 1919 to exercise a watchful care over legislation, both state and national. By 1927, the committee had sent many letters and at least 4 delegations to Washington. On the 4th occasion in 1927, Charles Livesey and Wetherell Hutton were able to present their letter directly to the president. They were humbled and surprised how ways opened when there seemed to be no way. By the next session of the meeting of things, Charles Livesey had died, and his co-workers at the boarding school, Wetherell Hutton, was asked to take his place as clerk of the Meeting for Sufferings. With the help of Carl Patterson and our young friend Alfred Winry, the committee had also sent a delegate to the board of Ohio State University to protest military training there. By the end of 1927, the legislative committee at least allowed a few young friends to join them in their work, recognizing that pressure had been building throughout the decade for the yearly meeting to appoint a peace committee from the broad membership so that young men and women could officially be part of that concern. The strains over how the voice of young friends could be heard had been especially evident in 1925, when the way did not open to appoint a peace committee. The disappointed group of 60 younger friends, who were quite aware of young friends' conferences and activities in other parts of the Quaker world, met in the meeting house yard. In gray dawn on the Sunday of yearly meeting week, they agreed among themselves that they were profoundly discontented with their role in Ohio yearly meeting. Only gradually in their discussion, however, did they realize that their main problem was one of silence. They did not give assent to the stirring world Christian vision of the annual epistles of New England yearly meeting, nor did they speak up for change and reform in their own yearly meeting. they had been too well schooled in silence and respect. These young friends faced their Wilburite temperament honestly. We know that it is largely self-consciousness that shuts up the response and keeps us quiet. We cannot always take back seats and look on. We must begin now to take the part of conscious members of the meeting, not that of a rather critical spectators. It was certainly not a coincidence that teacher Wetherill Hutton, who had first taught it only in 1892, called together all those who had been his students to a meeting in the collecting room that evening. For the 50 or 60 people who gathered, it was a unifying influence full of possibility and power, thanks to dedicated men and women like Wetherill Hutton. The society held together, even though some friends thought that the young were too interested in peace, which they thought was but a byproduct of inward peace. One elderly and weighty friend was heard to remark that he opposed the appointing of a peace committee because he was on too many committees already. Such a commitment reflected his deeply seated attitude that a weighty friend must be on all committees. Finally, 3 years later, in 1928, the way did open to appoint a peace committee. 10 years after the cauldron of 1917 to 1918 had produced a generation of peace-minded, world-minded young friends. Other changes were in the wind. The yearly meeting of 1928 was a gathering remarkable for its larger number of attenders and its 60 visitors. After several years of pressure, the yearly meeting agreed to move the date of yearly meeting from early September to late August so that parents and teachers of public school children, as well as college students, could attend yearly meeting. Another change introduced at about this time was the boarding school finally allowing girls to go to monthly and quarterly meeting without wearing Quaker bonnets. Soon it was decided that only mid-year vacations might as well be scheduled to include that day that the world calls Christmas. For the first time since Mount Pleasant and Olney had been founded. Another important change, this one in 1929, was that for the first time 4 women were appointed to the meeting for sufferings. Also in 1929, the printed minutes listed for the first time all standing committees, showing that women were now on all committees except for those dealing with property, finances, or printing. Meeting for Suffering had 36 members. The boarding school committee, 68 members. Primary education, 20 members. Peace committee, 39 members. Distribution of approved writing of friends, 40 members. Fiduciary trustees, 5 men. Trustees of Friends Boarding School Property, 4 men. Printing committee, 7 men. 2 other important changes during the 20s were the revision of the discipline in 1922 and the appointment of the fiduciary trustees to hold the various funds of the yearly meeting. The discipline had not been significantly revised since its adoption by Ohio Yearly Meeting in 1819. The Meeting for Sufferings Committee, which made the revisions, reorganized the original alphabetical order into a more logical, topical arrangement, modernized the language, and dropped the section on Negroes and slaves. Although disownment was still possible in the new discipline, the mood of the yearly meeting was very much against it, especially for those who married out. Even the case of a few men who had violated the peace testimony in World War I, a special meeting for sufferings committee had urged tenderness and restraint and urging meetings to deal very affectionately with them. The new discipline also made it clear that the women's meeting were not fully equal to the men's meeting. By the yearly meeting of 1929, Ohio Young Friends had held their first Young Friends Conference in spite of the disapproval of some of the very weighty Friends. In an evening meeting at yearly meeting time, Ed and Clara Stratton reported attending the All Friends Conference in Oskaloosa, Iowa, where 40 Oleanites had held a brief reunion. As long as it was able to remain vigorous, the Wilbur Union gave support to various forms of outreach and conference attending which could not yet be sanctioned by the yearly meeting as a whole. In spite of gradual changes and the vigorous activity of some young and older members, the yearly meeting was still declining in size. During the 1920s, there was a vigorous effort to upgrade and maintain the Friends elementary schools. In 1919 and 1920, for example, Anna Walton of Philadelphia was asked to visit all schools, making suggestions and help work out a uniform curriculum. The Education Association, the Primary School Committee, and the Olney Current had all worked together to keep up the morale and standards of these small schools. But economics and declining membership was making it increasingly difficult. In 1929, before the Great Depression had fully settled upon the land, there were still 8 elementary schools attended by 81 students. The Fall Olney Current included an 8-page summary of letters on the subject of whether it was worthwhile to continue these schools. Ohio Yearly Meeting ended the decade with one last quarterly meeting, Pennsville, one last monthly meeting, Pennsville, and one last preparative meeting, Barnesville. After many years of decline and many years of shepherding by committee of the yearly meetings, the once large and prosperous Pennsville quarterly meeting was finally laid down by a yearly meeting in November 1926, and its surviving meeting at Crester Hill again became part of Stillwater quarterly meeting, to which it had belonged many years earlier. The meeting at Pennsville had been discontinued in 1921, and the Barnesville meeting was discontinued in 1926. In 1922, the Pennsville Meeting House and grounds were purchased by William Embray to be used as a park and picnic grounds for the public, especially for the annual Embray Picnic, at which children were given free ice cream and candy, something which the donor had been deprived of in his youth. In its somewhat altered form, the Pennsville Meeting House and grounds are still available to the public, and an attempt to revive the old Harlem Springs picnic or halfway picnic was held there in 1976. This concludes the reading of Chapter 7, A Wider Quakerism, 1917 to 1929, in the Eye of Faith, A History of Ohio Yearly Meeting Conservative by William P. Tabor, Jr. In the next podcast, we'll start reading Chapter 8, A Second World War and Wider Quaker Service, 1930 to 1950. The words in our introduction were written by George Fox in 1656 in a letter to friends in the ministry. The music was composed and sung by Paulette Meyer. More information at her website, www.paulettemeyer.com.
Be patterns, be examples in all countries, places, islands, nations, wherever you come, that your carriage and life may preach among all sorts of people and to them. Then you will come to walk cheerfully over the world, answering that of God in every one, whereby in them ye may be a blessing, and make the witness of God in them to bless you.